Dear friends, thank you very much for inviting me to your conference. What I'm going to talk about here is some of the findings of the Parliamentary Committee on how to strengthen the green economy in Iceland. First, a few words about the Icelandic economy. We are traditionally a society of fishermen and farmers, and we have had our economy based on three pillars for the past decades. Number one, fishing. Number two, heavy industry. And number three, and rapidly growing, tourism. So the Icelandic economy has been for many years vulnerable to adverse trends in foreign markets, for instance, in the relative pricing of aluminium. So there is a strong need for diversification, and that is one of the impetus that made us want to delve into this issue of looking at how to green the Icelandic economy. Before we started this work, I was cautiously optimistic because there's been a very heated debate in Iceland about, on one hand, the need for nature conservation, and on the other hand, the need for job creation through heavy industry, particularly in the aluminium smelter industry. It's probably been the most dividing political issue in Iceland since the mid-90s. So I was realistic in my assumption that we would probably reach a point where we would get into a lot of heated political argument in this committee, but I must stress that the proposal for starting this process in the Icelandic Parliament was started by MPs from all the political parties, and I made an effort of getting representatives from all the 5 parties that are represented in the Icelandic Parliament to try to reach the point where people could agree on certain steps for moving in this direction. And what was very interesting is that we quite soon found out that we could reach a common ground, that it was sensible for Iceland to try to bridge this divide between the environmental camp and the heavy industry camp by agreeing that the sensible strategy for the 21st century in Iceland was bridging this divide between strong demands for job creation and growth on one hand and for sustainable development on the other hand. Why a green economy? The green economy is, and that is an international finding as you all know, a prerequisite for sustainable growth in the 21st century. And it is, of course, a logical reaction to one of the most pressing political problems that we face internationally, which is climate change. For Iceland, it's particularly important as a strategy because we have been focusing our promotional strategy as a country on our clean and pristine nature, and that is the most important magnet for inviting tourists to come and visit our country. So it makes sense for us to have, combined with that, an economic policy and an employment policy that is environmentally friendly. So we don't reach into a conflict between what we want to deliver as a nation and our big reliance on our clean natural environment on one hand, and then have an economic policy that is being dramatically reliant on heavy industry and demanding on harnessing our natural resources. The demand for green energy is obviously increasing, as my fellow presenters have demonstrated this morning, and the Icelanders, as Professor Sigfússon showed you, have a comparative advantage in terms of our extensive knowledge in the field of renewable energy and in terms of our comparative advantage demonstrated by the fact that more than 80% of our energy use comes from renewables. However, there is a big challenge. I mean, we have been finding out that Iceland has probably the largest ecological footprint in the world, and that is a challenge that calls for a swift and powerful response. What is the green economy? We started off in the parliamentary committee by looking for definitions, and it has to be said that internationally that you don't find a unanimous conclusion regarding definition on either green economy or green jobs. But this definition that you see on the screen comes from the United Nations Environmental Program. That the green economy is about economic activity that reduces carbon emissions, supports a more efficient use of energy and resources, and prevents the degradation of biological diversity and ecosystem services. So we're trying to increase value creation at the same time as we are reducing our demand on nature. And I think it's valuable to look at the green economy as a practical way to implement the ideology of sustainable development. One of the practical challenges is to define and classify what are the green jobs. This definition is one that we found was valuable, and it comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they have this twofold definition. On one hand, pure green jobs, jobs in businesses that produce goods or services that benefit the environment or support the conservation of natural resources. And the second class has to do with what Professor Sigfússon was telling you about earlier, which is about greening the industries that are already in existence, greening the jobs in businesses that you would perhaps normally classify as being brown businesses. So these are jobs that include making production processes more environmentally friendly or less demanding in the future with respect to the use of natural resources. And that is, I think, actually a very important point, because we don't want the green economy to be situated in a small segment of the economy. We want this to be an ideology, an idea and a development that every part of the Icelandic economy looks upon as an opportunity, as a way of moving forward in the right direction. The parliamentary committee was established in September 2010, following the approval by the Parliament of a parliamentary resolution that called for the establishment of such a parliamentary committee. And we worked for 12 months and presented our findings in the fall of 2011. And we started off with this general vision for Iceland, which says that Iceland can be, in our opinion, a role model as a green economy in the future. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be in the next few years because of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. But it is a long-term objective that we think is realistic if we start moving in the right direction right away. We should obviously emphasize our clean and natural environment, our sustainable use of energy, on innovation, which is extremely important. And then we have to recognize that we have to educate our public. We have to educate ourselves in the parliament. We have to educate the private businesses, and we have to educate the general public about sustainability, starting in elementary school and going up through the whole education system. And that's going to be a challenge as well, because we have had this dialogue between these conflicting camps, and a lot of people look upon the green issues as something that is highly political, something that is situated or located in other households in Iceland, in other parts of the Icelandic society. So we need to be patient, and we need to recognize that there's going to be a long and quite difficult learning process for many of us. The findings are, they are in two layers. We are presenting 8 general policy statements, and then around 50 more direct, more practical proposals for action. And these 8 policy statements are the following. First of all, we think it's extremely important that the government sets an example and creates conditions for the development of a green economy in Iceland. Number 2, we need to use economic incentives in place of command and control to promote green economic activity, and we have a lot of proposals that are following from this example. Obviously, one of the objectives is to create more green jobs, and that is important now because we have an historically high level of unemployment in Iceland following the crash of our banking system. And number 4, we have to promote green investment, both locally and from foreign sources. Obviously, we need to learn from our colleagues abroad, and it's very important in our findings that we use the fundamental principles of the Rio Declaration, both the polluter pays principle and the precautionary principle, which we think need to be an integral part of the public fiscal and employment policy in the future. And the polluter pays principle should be the basis for implementing fees and tariffs in the future to finance those economic incentives that I mentioned previously. Education on sustainable development and environmental issues has to be increased and given a more comprehensive footing in our education system. And then, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the green economy needs to be an integral part of the national promotional strategy. As I mentioned before, our findings include 50 proposals. I will not go through all of them, obviously, today, but I want to give you some examples and how they sort of center around a few overriding themes. First of all, the theme of the state as a model. Obviously, it is our finding that the green economy needs to be a priority in the government's economic and employment policy, and that policy is being made at the moment on cabinet level. It's the first time, actually, that Iceland embarks upon that project, amazingly enough, to make a comprehensive economic policy. Number 2, the Parliament, all the ministries of the cabinet and public institutions, they need to implement environmental management plans in order to reduce waste and reduce negative environmental impact. Number 3, and that is very important in terms of the state using its power to expedite the development into the green economy. It has to do with the green public procurement, which basically means the amount of money that the state is spending each year on buying products and services. And if we manage to increase the level of green public procurement in the national budget, that's going to be probably the single most important act that the state can do in order to expedite this development. So we want to see eco-friendly calls for tenders increase to 50% of the public procurement in 2015 and 80% in 2020. Another example has to do with what Iceland can do internationally. We think it's important that Iceland ratifies Appendix 6 to the MARPOL Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. As Professor Sigfússon mentioned previously, one of our challenges is that we are using fossil fuels for our shipping fleet, and we need to make dramatic steps to revolutionize the Icelandic fleet. And we have some troubling signs that the Icelandic market is not very receptive at the moment towards new technology, and we need to address that full force. We also see in the future that Iceland can show a signal of intent by declaring the exclusive economic zone around Iceland as an emission control area. The second theme is proposals that have to do with administration and analysis. First of all, I want to emphasize that we think it is vital that the green economy issue is located in the Prime Minister's office, which will then coordinate the work and input of all cabinet ministries. And we think this is a sign of the times that we need to break down the barriers between the relevant ministries in the cabinet. We are seeing promising signs already following the economic crash. And this is a prime example of a subject which will ultimately fail unless ministries can find ways to work together. Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, and so forth. And the PMO's office will also have to initiate a consultative process with local governments. That's one of the segments of our work that we didn't have much time to develop in the 12-month period, but that's probably vital if we want to really make an effort in changing Icelandic society into a green economy. We also have to acknowledge that we have to make some changes in our measurements of growth. We use, like most countries, GDP to measure growth in Iceland, but we have reached the conclusion that it would be beneficial for us to calculate as well the genuine progress indicator, which includes the cost for nature of our economic efforts, and also other elements that are very important when measuring welfare and sustainable growth. We have had recommendations for a number of years from OECD that we need to use cost-benefit analysis to measure the environmental impact of heavy industry projects, of plants in general, and we concur with that finding from OECD. And then we propose that we comprehensively revise all the legislation on waste in order to remove existing barriers to the further development of the recycling industry in Iceland. There are a number of proposals in our findings that have to do with job creation and investments, and here are some of them. First of all, I want to emphasize that we have traditionally had a very low share of foreign direct investment into our economy, and for the past decades, most of it has been solely confined with the aluminium industry. We want to obviously change that, and we think we have a lot of opportunities to define some key areas where we would be able to attract foreign investment. Some examples have been mentioned, like the data center industry, everything to do with changing our transport sector into using green fuel. I think it's important that politicians refrain from the opportunity of choosing particular technologies, but we should definitely emphasize that there's a lot of ways that we have in order to change our car fleet, our shipping fleet, from using fossil fuel into using renewables. We want to establish a green venture capital fund in a public-private partnership that includes both domestic and foreign investors. And we have had encouraging signs already that there is interest both from local and also foreign investment funds, for instance, in the Nordic countries. So we want to try to capitalize on that interest and see this fund being established in the very near future. Also, we have a fund called the Technology Development Fund, which is the main vehicle for supporting innovation by the government in Iceland. And we suggest that part of that fund will be provided with more funds that will be specifically designated to funding green innovation projects and R&D projects in this field. Another example, the government needs to make further steps in order to increase organic production. And we want to use an example from our Nordic countries, so we can increase the organic production to a level of 15% of national agricultural production by the year 2020. Some examples of the economic incentives. First of all, we want to emphasize that the renewable energy for transport will not be taxed before its share has reached 20% of the total use in transport. There's a number of proposals that have to do with reimbursing both private businesses and public institutions for going green. For instance, if they invest in implementing certified environmental management systems, they can be reimbursed for up to 20% of that cost, up to a certain maximum. I mentioned the pollution fees earlier, and we want to use pollution fees in the future to partially to reimburse private businesses that invest in pollution prevention strategies and solutions. And then we need to find ways to reimburse public institutions to expedite the development towards green public procurement. Finally, we need to address the issue of the green revolution of the mind, as we could call it, and one of the most important proposals in that respect has to do with what Professor Sigfússon demonstrated earlier, which is finding ways of introducing to the Icelandic businesses ways to start this travel from brown to green. So, as you heard earlier, the Innovation Center Iceland has already started working on a methodology that encourages the greening of Icelandic businesses. We have to educate our public more about the alternative means of transport and the relationship between different means of transport and health. And then we have a proposal that has to do with revising all legislation that specifically addresses public institutions in order to integrate the concept and the idea of sustainable development into the statutory purposes of these institutions. I mentioned earlier that this committee, the Parliamentary Committee on Strengthening the Green Economy, had included members from all the political parties that are represented in the Icelandic Parliament. And the original resolution that was put forward in the spring of 2010 had 18 MPs from all the 5 parties supporting the resolution. And we reached a conclusion in our final report which was unanimous. And as I mentioned earlier, that's sort of exceeded my expectations. I thought we would get into more trouble in reaching the conclusion and that we would have maybe some splinter groups that could not agree with the majority on where to go. That did not happen, and I'm very pleased and enthusiastic about that finding. And also the process that followed in the Parliament after we had presented our findings was in the same way. That the standing committee that had the job of working on the resolution, sending it out to relevant stakeholders in the Icelandic society. They also reached a unanimous decision that the resolution should be approved on the floor with 9 votes to 0. And the final hurdle was reached on March 20th when the Parliament approved the resolution unanimously with 43 votes to none. So I think this shows that we can indeed reach a political consensus on important policy-making issues that have to do with key aspects of our economic policy in the future, and that is perhaps surprising, I'm sure, to many of the Icelandic members in the audience, but it shows that this can be done, and there are encouraging signs in the Parliament that people are on various issues finding more common ground than we have been used to in the past. And I'm also I think it's also a very important finding that the Parliament, that legislative branch can be used as a powerful force for policy making, which is also a little bit different from what we're used to. We've been used to, and there's been a lot of talk in the previous years about the legislative branch being a subsidiary of the executive branch, being weak in terms of expertise, weak in terms of political will to stand up and be counted, and that's sort of an auxiliary reason for being optimistic that this work shows us a way to a more fruitful future for us all. And so, like I told you, this program was approved in Parliament only a couple of months ago, on March 20th, but already the government has showed a will of intent by approving last Friday an investment plan for 2030 to 2015. And that investment plan includes a proposal for providing 25 million euros towards implementing the first phase of the action plan on strengthening the green economy in Iceland. And in this first phase, we will give priority to proposals that support R&D and innovation, to proposals that increase investments, that introduce economic incentives, and some of the green job creation proposals that I mentioned earlier. So that's a very encouraging sign, very important step that the government has taken to ensure that some of these findings are implemented as early as next year. And so what is happening at the moment is that the Prime Minister's office is already taking the first steps of designating a task force to finalize an action plan based on these proposals in our report. We have also started discussing possibilities of a cooperation with the local governments in Iceland, and it's encouraging that we've already received the first offer from a local government in Iceland that has showed their will and intent to become sort of a pilot community in implementing the strategies of the green economy. And that is a very encouraging sign that we will have a fruitful cooperation with the local government in implementing these proposals in the near future. Thank you very much.